Okay, I'm going to start reading again. So this article is titled, Guts of the World. Fat worms squirm in a puddle after a rain. Then, slurp, they're gone. Down into the dirt they call home. With the little bristles on their bodies, they drag leaves and sticks down with them. In this way, they mix the soil. The holes they dig also act as superhighways for the vital grain. This important water runs through the holes to reach the plant roots below. Best of all, worms eat bits of old matter, such as dead leaves in the soil. Then, when they pass it from their bodies, presto, they've made the best plant food ever. What would we do without these wiggly wonders? People throughout history have recognized the value of earthworms. It is said that Cleopatra, a famous queen in ancient Egypt, saw how worms made soil better for growing food. Because of this, she thought worms were sacred. She thought they should be honored. She made laws to protect them. People could be put to death for taking worms out of the country. Farmers were careful not to touch them. They didn't want to upset the god they thought was in charge of growing things. A great Greek thinker named Aristotle liked earthworms too. He called them the intestines or guts of the world. Oh, so that's where I see the name of the article comes from. The famous philosopher Aristotle. He thought worms were the guts of the world. In other words, the intestines of the world. And if you forgot what intestines are, you can just look at the image right next to you, the picture on your wall. Okay. He meant that earthworms were kind of like the guts in a person's body. Guts break down the food a person eats into small bits in his or her. I'm sorry, I read this wrong. Guts break down the food a person eats into small bits his or her cells can use. Cells are the building blocks of living things. This process compares to what earthworms do to once living matter in the soil. They break it down small enough to mix with the water that plants take in from their roots. This rich water makes the plants strong. A famous scientist, Charles Darwin, studied common earthworms for 40 years. He experimented to test his ideas about the importance of earthworms to the world. He believed they moved and mixed the soil. He tested his ideas by putting a stone in his yard and gave orders that no one should touch it. Then he measured to see how long it took the worms to heap the soil around the stone. He also tested the earthworm's senses by tickling, shaking, and blowing on them. He tested to see if they could hear by asking his wife and children to play instruments for the worms. When the worms did not react, he concluded they did not have a sense of hearing. The last book Darwin ever wrote was about earthworms. He wanted people to know how important common earthworms have been to the history of the world. Okay, so that was your first article. Your second article is titled, Wondrous Worms of the World. What's cool and wet and wiggly all over? An earthworm, of course. There are about 2,700 kinds of earthworms in the world. Earthworms come in many sizes. Sorry about the distraction. Let's start over. What's cool and wet and wiggly all over? An earthworm, of course. There are about 2,700 kinds of earthworms in the world. Earthworms come in many sizes, but they all keep busy eating dead plant matter. Then they make castings or worm waste. The castings help soil to be rich and plants to grow. Often, we don't notice worms, but they're always there. The work they do makes it possible for us to have good food to eat. Let's learn about the different kinds of worms. First, we have the red wigglers. Red wigglers are the kind of worms that are about as thick as toothpicks. Oh, that's very, very thin, I would say. They are 2 to 3 inches long. They live in dead things like old leaves on top of the soil. Oh, so their length is 2 to 3 inches long, but by saying thin, I refer to the width of toothpicks, and you know how narrow toothpicks are, right? Yeah. Okay. So these red wigglers live in dead things like old leaves on top of the soil. They are the worms that gardeners use for making compost for their gardens. Compost is a dead matter from such things as rotted grass clippings, leaves, and kitchen waste. Red wigglers turn this matter into dirt. Wiggler worms often have babies. Oh, I read that a bit wrong. Wiggler worms have babies often and grow to be adults in a few weeks. They can gobble up the compost quickly. Common earthworms? Another type of worm is the reddish-gray earthworm. It is found in the upper layer of dirt. These worms are about the same length as red wigglers, so that was 2 to 3 inches long. They are not quite as wide as pencils in thickness. Oh, so they are not quite as wide as pencils in thickness. That means not very wide, narrower than pencils. These earthworms are often used as bait for catching fish, but they also help to eat dead plant matter. Their big job, however, is to act as soil mixers. They pull dead matter along with them as they burrow their sideways tunnels. About 1 million earthworms live in every acre of soil. 1 million earthworms can eat about 10 tons of dead matter in 1 year. Now let's go to night crawlers. Night crawlers. What kinds of worms are these? I'm guessing they crawl in the night. Okay. Though the common earthworm is often called a night crawler, that name also belongs to a larger type of earthworm. Night crawlers can grow to be about 8 to 10 inches long and are pencil-sized in width. Night crawlers make up and down tunnels. They live as deep as 6.5 feet under the soil. They get their name from coming up to feed on top of the soil at night or when it rains. Now we're learning about prairie worms. The larger cousins of night crawlers, the palouse, only live in the prairie regions of Washington State and parts of Idaho in the United States. Glaciers covered this area millions of years ago. When the glaciers melted, they left an area of rich, rolling prairie. Now it is covered with a thick growth of grasses and wildflowers. The worms like it because it is very damp, and the soil is especially thick. The worms live as deep as 15 feet under the ground. Old stories said they were as long as baseball bats, but when scientists found some recently, and experts identified them as palouse, they were not that long. Palouse have almost see-through bodies. These worms are very rare and like to stay hidden. They are so rare, in fact, that many people thought they were extinct or no longer living on Earth. Now let's go to the Oregon giants. Palouse worms' next door neighbors, the Oregon, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Oregon giant earthworms aren't seen much either. They are nearly white and grow to be 2 to 3 feet long. Wow, that's about just a little shorter than my sister. Like, just about a feet shorter than my sister.
That is really big.
Yeah, their length is quite long compared to the length of the height of my sister. I don't know if that made a lot of sense. Okay. When they are bothered, they are said to give off a smell like flowers. Oh, nice. That's unexpected. Beautiful or wonderfully lovely floral fragrance coming from none other than earthworms. Your favorite kind of animal.
No, sometimes when flowers are being attacked, they give a stinky smell to other flowers, so they know to try to let the other natural plants that something bad is
So could it be flower stink?
Yeah.
Smell like... But when I see something written as the smell of flowers or smelling like flowers, I just imagine lovely floral fragrances. I don't really think of stink or stench of any sort.
Here it says when they are bothered. So when flowers are bothered, they sometimes make that smell.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that. Well, thank you for educating me, I guess. Oh, yeah? I love that. I love that you learned it from the Brains On podcast. Okay, they live under fir and maple forests in that area. They like the fine, deep soil that is not often bothered. Scientists believe the Palouse and Oregon worms are becoming rare because the places where they like to live are being destroyed. The land is being cleared and the soil torn up for farming. Also, other kinds of earthworms are taking over their area. Oh my goodness. World's Whoppers. Worms from New Zealand and Australia win the prize for being the biggest in the world. I think they mean the longest. Okay, the biggest. Both can grow longer than 3 feet and are as thick as a person's finger. Oh my goodness. The North Auckland worm is also special because it glows in the dark. People say the glowing worm is bright enough to read by. Oh. The worms from Australia are fragile or can be hurt easily. They can die if they are even bruised a little. So the government has laws to protect them. Farmers are asked to fence off areas where the worms are known to live so they won't be bothered. The worms like best living in soil with lots of clay near water. The worms are also in danger because they only produce 1 baby a year, so not enough offspring. Then it takes several years for the baby worm to become an adult, so their numbers are dropping. Some worms seem more special than others, but they are all important. Without worms, soil might not contain everything it needs to grow the foods people need. Alright, now comes the portion of your assignment. We already went over this. Essentially, after having read the 2 articles about worms, you'll be writing 3 or more paragraphs for posters you might use for a worm exhibit at a science fair. Okay? So hopefully you've been taking notes.